Richard Gere had always prided himself on being a good husband. He wasn't the most romantic, and he certainly wasn't flawless. But he had always been there for his wife, Sandra Bullock. For 30 years, they had navigated life's trials together, raising 2 daughters, all are married now, buying a home, and dealing with the routine stresses of work and family. Their marriage had its share of arguments and disagreements, but Richard believed that their bond was solid, unshakable. He had built his life around that belief. But recently, Richard had noticed subtle shifts in Sandra's behavior. It started with little things, like the way she seemed preoccupied during dinner, or how she would smile absent-mindedly at her phone, typing out messages with a speed and enthusiasm that made Richard feel oddly excluded. She began going out more frequently, using the excuse of meeting up with friends he'd never heard of. The gym became her new obsession, a place she suddenly visited almost every day. Richard tried to ignore the creeping unease in his gut, dismissing it as just the monotony of long-term marriage getting to his head. After all, everyone needed their space. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, Richard found himself alone in the living room, the soft hum of the TV, the only sound in the house. It was a familiar scene. Him on the couch, waiting for Sandra to return from one of her late nights out. But tonight, the weight of her absence felt heavier. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and Richard's patience began to fray. He glanced at the mantelpiece, where a family photo sat, the 3 of them beaming under the sun on a beach vacation from years ago. He stared at his own smile in the picture, the way he had his arms wrapped around Sandra and their daughters, and felt a pang of something, nostalgia maybe, or perhaps a deep, unnameable sadness. The happiness in that photo felt like a relic of another life, one that was slipping away from him with each passing day. When Sandra finally walked through the door, it was well past 1 in the morning. Richard looked up, his heart heavy with the questions he was too afraid to ask. She was dressed more fashionably than usual, heels, a sleek black dress that hugged her figure. Her hair styled just so. There was a faint scent of cologne that wasn't his, mingling with her own perfume, and it hit Richard like a physical blow. He could feel his heart sink, an icy dread pooling in his stomach. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but it came out more like a croak. Sandra barely glanced at him, her eyes tired but detached. She murmured a quick hi as she kicked off her shoes and headed straight for the bedroom, her pace brisk, as if she couldn't wait to put distance between them. Richard sat there, frozen, watching her retreating form. There was no kiss, no affectionate touch, not even a proper goodnight. Just the cold, mechanical motions of a woman who was going through the motions, doing what she had to before escaping to the sanctuary of their bed. No, her bed, because it hadn't felt like their bed in months. Richard's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other, none of them making any sense. Where had she been? Who was she with? Was she tired because she had spent hours dancing, drinking, maybe even flirting with someone else? The questions swirled in his head, but he couldn't bring himself to voice them. Instead, he sat in the silence, his fingers gripping the armrest of the couch so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He knew he should confront her, demand answers, but a part of him was paralyzed by fear. Fear of what he might hear. Fear of shattering the fragile illusion that had kept him going. So he said nothing, letting the silence fill the space between them like a thick, suffocating fog. As Sandra closed the bedroom door behind her, Richard felt a deep, gnawing emptiness settle in his chest, a void that he had no idea how to fill. It was the first time in his life that he felt truly alone, even with her just a few steps away. The next few weeks were a suffocating blur of tension and unease for Richard. The growing distance between him and Sandra knotted him relentlessly. Their conversations, once filled with warmth and ease, had become stilted and awkward, like they were strangers fumbling through small talk. Sandra's new routine only fueled his paranoia. She was out more often than not, always with some vague excuse. One evening, as Sandra prepared to leave for her usual late-night gym session, Richard's anxiety reached a breaking point. He watched her get ready, noting how much effort she put into her appearance. Her hair perfectly styled, her makeup meticulously applied. It wasn't how someone usually dressed for the gym. His gut churned with unease, and when she kissed him goodbye, it felt like a ghost of a kiss, barely there, just a formality. As soon as the door closed behind her, Richard made a decision. He couldn't keep living in this torment, constantly questioning what was happening behind his back. He grabbed his car keys and left the house, determined to follow her and find out the truth. He trailed Sandra's car from a distance, careful to keep far enough behind so she wouldn't notice. His heart pounded in his chest, each turn of the wheel tightening the knot in his stomach. The drive seemed to take forever, but eventually, Sandra's car pulled into the parking lot of a gym on the other side of town. Richard parked his car a block away, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to keep an eye on the entrance. He waited. The minutes dragged on, turning into an hour, then 2. Richard's mind raced with possibilities, each one more damning than the last. He stared at the gym's entrance, willing Sandra to come out alone, hoping against hope that his fears were unfounded, but deep down he knew he wasn't going to like what he saw. Finally, the doors swung open and Sandra emerged, but she wasn't alone. Richard's heart lurched as he saw her walking out with a man. Her arm linked with his, her head tilted toward him as she laughed at something he said. The man was younger, probably in his late 20s, with a casual confidence that made Richard's blood boil. They walked together toward a nearby bar, their bodies close, too close. The way she looked at him with that bright, carefree smile. It was a look she hadn't given Richard in years. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he watched them from his car. He felt a rage building inside him, a fury so intense it made his vision blur. He wanted to storm out of the car, confront them, demand an explanation, but something held him back. Instead, he sat there, paralyzed by a mixture of disbelief and anger, watching them through the windows of the bar. Inside, they seemed oblivious to the world around them. They shared drinks, their laughter carrying through the glass. Their faces lit up with a kind of joy that twisted the knife deeper into Richard's heart. Every touch, every smile was a betrayal. He watched as the man leaned in, whispering something into Sandra's ear that made her laugh and swatted him playfully. The sight was unbearable, yet Richard couldn't tear his eyes away. When they finally left the bar, it was well past midnight. Richard followed them at a distance, his mind reeling, every step making his blood boil hotter. They didn't head back to the gym, or part ways like he had hoped. Instead, they walked toward a nearby hotel, their hands intertwined like a couple without a care in the world. Richard parked a few blocks away, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched them enter the hotel together. The sight of them disappearing into the lobby was the final straw, snapping the last thread of his self-control. The rage inside him solidified into something cold, calculated. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a deliberate, heartless act, and he couldn't let it slide. As he sat in his car watching the hotel entrance, Richard felt something dark and unrelenting take hold of him. He knew what he had to do, and there was no turning back. That night, Richard couldn't find a shred of peace. Sleep eluded him as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with images of Sandra and the younger man. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that festered with every passing moment. His thoughts spiraled into a dark abyss, alternating between the pain of her infidelity and the growing desire for revenge. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock amplifying his turmoil until he was seething, unable to stay still. By the time dawn began to break, Richard had made up his mind. He would confront her, demand the truth, and force her to face the consequences of her actions. The next morning, Richard was a storm waiting to break. He could barely look at Sandra as she moved around the kitchen, humming to herself as if nothing had changed. The sight of her acting so normal, so untouched by the guilt that was tearing him apart, only fueled his anger. When she finally sat down with a cup of coffee, Richard couldn't hold back any longer. Who was he? His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of his seething rage. Sandra looked up, startled by the harshness in his tone. "Who was who?" she asked, feigning innocence. "The young man you were with last night," Richard said, his eyes boring into hers. "The one you were holding hands with, laughing with. Don't play dumb, Sandra. I followed you." For a moment, Sandra's face paled, a flicker of panic crossing her features. but it was quickly replaced by a mask of indifference. She took a slow sip of her coffee before setting the cup down with a sigh. "Richard, it's not what you think," she said, her tone condescending, as if she were explaining something to a child. "It was just a bit of fun, nothing serious." "Fun!" Richard's voice shook with barely restrained fury. "You call sneaking around behind my back with some guy half your age fun? Do you even realize what you're saying?" Sandra rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair with a look of exasperation. "Richard, don't be so dramatic. We've been married for 30 years. People change. I've changed. You can't seriously expect me to stay the same person I was when we met?" Richard could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. "So what? You're just going to throw away everything we've built together because you're bored, because you need some excitement in your life?" "It's not about throwing anything away," Sandra said, her tone dismissive, as if the conversation was beneath her. "I'm just enjoying myself. You should try it sometime." "Enjoying yourself?" Richard repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "By betraying me? By tearing apart our family? What about our daughters, Sandra? What about the life we've created together?" Sandra shrugged, a casual, almost careless gesture that sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through Richard. "They're almost grown, Richard. They'll understand. Besides, we both know this marriage hasn't been working for a long time. Maybe it's time we both moved on." "Move on." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. The coldness with which she dismissed their life together was staggering. A betrayal, not just of their marriage, but of everything they had ever shared. He had always believed that, despite their differences and the inevitable wear and tear of 3 decades together, they had a foundation strong enough to withstand anything. But now, it was clear that Sandra had already made up her mind to leave him behind. "So that's it?" Richard asked, his voice hollow, barely concealing the raw pain he felt. "You're just going to walk away from 30 years like it's nothing, like I'm nothing?" "Don't be so melodramatic, Richard," Sandra replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's just a bit of fun. It doesn't have to mean anything." But to Richard, it meant everything. In that moment, something inside him snapped, the remnants of his love for her crumbling into dust. He had spent years building a life with her, sacrificing, compromising, believing in their future together, and now she was telling him it was all meaningless, just a phase she was ready to leave behind. The fury that had been simmering within him boiled over, turning cold, hardening into something unforgiving. Sandra had made her choice, and now, so would he. The following evening, Richard found himself in a place he never thought he'd be again, standing outside the same dimly lit bar where he had first seen the truth about Sandra and her young lover. The neon sign flickered above him, casting a cold, harsh light over the entrance. Richard lingered in the shadows, his heart a storm of emotions, his mind replaying the scene from the night before, a loop of betrayal that wouldn't let him go. Inside, the bar was alive with the usual hum of laughter and chatter. But to Richard, it was just noise, a backdrop to the twisted drama playing out in his life. He watched as Sandra and the younger man entered, their bodies close, their laughter blending into the din. They were so blatant, so carefree, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. It was clear now that they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The secrecy was gone, replaced by brazen, unapologetic displays of affection that made Richard's skin crawl. Richard stayed in the shadows, his eyes never leaving them. He watched as they found a booth near the back, the same one they had occupied the night before. They ordered drinks, their conversation animated, filled with smiles and touches that had once belonged to him. Every gesture, every laugh, was a knife twisting in his gut. The bar's low light did nothing to hide their connection. The way they leaned into each other, the way Sandra's hand lingered on the man's arm, the way she looked at him with a warmth and affection that had long been absent from her gaze toward Richard. The minutes dragged on like hours, each one pushing Richard closer to the edge. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of anger, pain, and a dark, growing resolve. He couldn't tear his eyes away, even as his mind screamed at him to leave, to walk away and never look back. But his feet remained planted, his body tense, like a spring coiled too tight, ready to snap. When they finally left the bar, Richard followed at a distance, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. They were oblivious to his presence, too wrapped up in each other to notice the man trailing them through the quiet streets. Richard's mind raced, each step closer to them, pulling him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. They wandered aimlessly, laughing and chatting, until they reached a secluded park. The night was cool, the air filled with the scent of grass and the distant sound of crickets. The park was empty, a perfect stage for the final act of their betrayal. The younger man wrapped his arms around Sandra, pulling her close, their silhouettes merging in the dim light. Richard's heart froze as he heard the man's voice, smug and careless, cutting through the night air like a blade. "She's mine for tonight, old man. We're going to have a wild time until we get satisfied." Sandra's laughter followed, light and cruel. She turned, glancing back at Richard, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of mockery and indifference. She walked toward him, her steps slow, deliberate. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove into the abyss. "Don't worry, darling," she said with a smirk, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'll be back when I'm done." And then she turned away, laughing as she rejoined her lover, leaving Richard standing there, paralyzed by the cold realization that there was no coming back from this. As they walked away, disappearing into the shadows, Richard felt something inside him break, a final snap that sent him tumbling into a place where there was no room for forgiveness, only a burning, relentless desire for revenge. Richard spent the next few days in a haze, his mind a constant loop of pain and anger, replaying the betrayal over and over again. The image of Sandra laughing, her hand on that younger man's arm, haunted him day and night. The weight of her mockery, the way she had dismissed their life together as if it were a mere inconvenience, was too much for him to bear. He felt hollowed out, every emotion drained from him except for one, the burning need to make them pay. He tried to carry on with his life, but everything felt meaningless. Food lost its taste, sleep was elusive, and work was nothing more than a series of motions he went through, detached and numb. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he seemed lost and thought, but no one dared to ask. Richard was a man unraveling, and anyone who looked at him could see it. It was during one of those sleepless nights as he stared at the ceiling that the idea first took root in his mind. At first, it was just a fleeting thought, something that shocked him with its intensity. But as the days wore on, that thought grew, took shape and solidified into something cold and calculated. If Sandra wanted to throw away their life, if she thought she could mock him and move on without consequences, then she was wrong, terribly wrong. Richard started planning, his mind working with a meticulousness that surprised even him. He began by observing them closely, tracking their every move. He knew their routine now, where they went when they met and how long they stayed together. He noted the days they were most likely to meet, the places they favored, and the patterns they followed. His obsession grew, feeding on the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. But watching wasn't enough. Richard needed more. He needed to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no mistakes. So he did something he never imagined he would do. He bought a gun. The process was easier than he had expected. The exchange of money for the cold, heavy metal in his hand felt surreal, like a scene from a movie. But this was no movie. This was his life, his shattered world, and now, this gun was a part of it. He practiced with it, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the power it represented. Each shot he fired at the range was a release of the rage that had been building inside him. Each bullet a promise of the vengeance he would soon unleash. He kept the gun hidden, a dark secret that only he knew, waiting for the right moment to use it. That moment came sooner than he expected. The night was cool, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Richard had followed them again, just as he had before. But this time there was no hesitation, no doubt. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with a grim determination that chilled him to the bone. They were laughing, holding hands, oblivious to the world around them, as they made their way to the same hotel they had been to before. It was a place that had become their haven, a sanctuary for their betrayal. Richard watched them from the shadows, his hand resting on the gun hidden beneath his coat. He waited until they disappeared inside before he moved, each step taking him closer to the moment he had been planning for days. As he entered the hotel, the front desk clerk barely glanced at him, too absorbed in their work to notice the dark look on Richard's face. He moved through the lobby with a single-minded focus, his eyes scanning the hallways until he found the room number he had memorized. The door was slightly ajar, their voices muffled but unmistakable. Richard's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as he stood in front of the hotel room door, his knuckles white from gripping the gun hidden beneath his coat. Every step that had led him here replayed in his mind, like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The betrayal, the lies, the mockery, all of it culminated in this moment. He had crossed a line within himself, one that he knew could never be uncrossed. There was no turning back. He could hear them inside, their voices muffled but unmistakable. They were laughing, oblivious to the storm about to crash down on them. The sound of Sandra's laughter, so carefree, so full of life, sliced through him like a knife. That laughter had once been his comfort, his joy, but now it was the final insult. Richard raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the hallway, a hollow, ominous thud that seemed to reverberate through his entire being. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to happen. This was it, the point of no return. The door swung open, and there he was, the younger man. Standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of surprise and confusion. For a split second their eyes met, and Richard saw the realization flicker in the man's gaze. Just before Richard shoved his way into the room, the younger man stumbled back, but Richard was relentless, his hand already pulling the gun from his coat. Sandra was sitting on the bed, her back to the door, but when she heard the commotion, she turned. Her eyes went wide as she saw Richard standing there. The gun aimed at them. Her scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that seemed to freeze time itself. "Richard, what the hell are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice trembling with fear. Richard's grip tightened on the gun, his knuckles turning white. "You think you can just walk all over me?" he snarled, his voice cold and unfamiliar to his own ears. "You think you can laugh in my face and get away with it?" The younger man took a hesitant step forward as if trying to defuse the situation, but Richard quickly pointed the gun at him, freezing him in place. "Stay right there," Richard hissed, his eyes burning with a fury that made the younger man falter. Sandra scrambled off the bed, her face contorted with fear and desperation. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Let's just talk about this. We can work something out." Richard laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. "Work something out. There's nothing to work out. You've already made your choice." The younger man, his hands raised in a placating gesture, tried to speak, his voice calm but laced with fear. "Look, man, we didn't mean any harm. Let's just cool down and shut up," Richard roared, his finger trembling on the trigger. His mind was a whirl of pain and anger, and the gun in his hand felt like the only anchor he had left. "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose." Without warning, Richard pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a thunderous crack that echoed off the walls of the small hotel room. The younger man's body jerked as the bullet tore through him, and then he collapsed to the floor, his blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him. The room seemed to tilt, the world narrowing to the side of the man's lifeless body, lying at Richard's feet. Sandra's scream shattered the silence, raw and filled with horror. She rushed to the younger man's side, her hands frantically pressing against the wound, but it was useless. The life was already draining from his eyes. She looked up at Richard, her face streaked with tears, her hands covered in blood. "Richard, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. I'm sorry. I was wrong. We can fix this." But Richard was beyond reason, beyond anything except the cold, unyielding need for retribution. He had come too far, crossed too many lines to stop now, the weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him, suffocating, relentless. He raised the gun again, his hands steady this time. "You destroyed our family," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you get to live with the consequences." Sandra's eyes widened in terror, her pleas turning to desperate cries, but it was too late. Richard's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gun roared once more. The sound was final, an echo of the life that had once been there, now shattered beyond repair. Sandra slumped to the floor, her body falling beside her lover's, the two of them lying together in death as they had been in life. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over Richard like a suffocating blanket. He stared at the scene before him, his mind numb, unable to process the full reality of what he had done. He had taken everything from them, just as they had taken everything from him. And now, there was nothing left. Richard stood in the hotel room, staring at the lifeless bodies on the floor. The weight of what he had just done settled heavily on his shoulders like a suffocating fog that refused to lift. The room, which had been filled with tension and chaos just moments ago, was now eerily quiet. The only sound, the slow, rhythmic drip of blood pooling on the floor. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him with an almost physical force. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. His mind was numb, struggling to process the reality of his actions. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross, and the finality of it was staggering. But even through the haze of shock, one thought cut through clearly. He couldn't stay here. The police would arrive soon, and when they did, there would be no escape. The weight of his crime would come crashing down on him, and there would be no way to explain it, no way to justify the bloodshed. Richard snapped into action, his movements mechanical and detached. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully wiped the gun clean, erasing any trace of his fingerprints. He placed the weapon on the floor next to the bodies, a parting gesture that seemed both final and hollow. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a harsh reminder of the ticking clock. He had to leave, now. Without looking back, Richard turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the hallway. He moved quickly, his mind racing as he navigated the hotel corridors. The adrenaline surging through his veins, sharp in his senses, making every sound, every movement feel amplified. But as he stepped into the lobby, he forced himself to slow down, to blend in. He couldn't afford to draw attention. The hotel staff and guests were oblivious to the horrors that had just unfolded upstairs. Richard walked through the lobby, his face a mask of calm, his steps deliberate. He exited the hotel and headed straight for his car, parked a few blocks away. His heart was still racing, but his mind was already shifting to the next phase of his plan. He drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors as he sped through the streets. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, regret, and grim determination. He knew he couldn't go home, not to the house filled with memories now tainted by betrayal and blood. There was nothing left for him there, only the wreckage of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. There was only one option. He had to disappear. Richard drove to a remote area on the outskirts of the city, a place where the dense woods swallowed the roads and the silence was absolute. He parked the car and began walking, each step taking him further from the life he had known. This was part of the plan he had prepared for, a contingency he had never imagined he would need, but had set in place, just in case. The secret bank account, the fake passport, it was all coming into play now, his only lifeline. As he reached the edge of the woods, Richard glanced back at the road. A final farewell to the world he was leaving behind. He made his way to the nearest airport, his movements swift and practiced, as if on autopilot. The fake passport felt foreign in his hand, a stark reminder of the life he was about to step into, a life that would be defined by running, by hiding, by the knowledge of what he had done. He bought a one-way ticket to a country far away, a place where he knew he could vanish, leaving everything behind. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Richard looked out the window, watching the city fade into the distance. The enormity of his actions finally began to settle in, a heavy, inescapable weight. But there was no going back now. He had made his choice, and he would live with it. Far away from the life he once knew, from the man he once was, Richard settled into his new life, a life meticulously constructed far from the remnants of his past. He had taken great care to erase any trace of the man he once was. His appearance was altered, his hair now a different shade, cut shorter, and his face clean-shaven, devoid of the familiar beard that had once been a part of his identity. He had adopted a new name, a new backstory, and settled in a small town nestled in the mountains of South America. A place so remote that even if someone were searching for him, they would never think to look there. The town was quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves and asked few questions. It was perfect for Richard, who had no interest in forming new relationships or becoming a part of the community. He found work as a handyman, fixing up the old houses that dotted the town. The physical labor kept him busy, and the solitude suited him. On the surface, it was the perfect escape. But beneath that surface, the turmoil of his actions roiled like a storm. The nights were the worst. When the sun set and the town slipped into silence, Richard was left alone with his thoughts. The images of that night, the night when he had crossed a line he could never return from, played over and over in his mind. He would see Sandra's face, the shock in her eyes as she realized what was happening. He could hear the deafening crack of the gunshots, the sound echoing in his ears, a sound he couldn't escape even in the deepest of sleeps. Richard would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of his small, sparsely furnished room, the guilt gnawing at him like a relentless predator. The satisfaction he had felt in the moments after the killings had long since faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. He had gotten his revenge, but at what cost? He had destroyed not just Sandra's life, but his own. The woman he had once loved, the life they had built together, all of it was gone, reduced to ashes in a fit of rage that now seemed almost senseless. In the daylight hours, Richard tried to push these thoughts aside, burying himself in work. But the memories were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to pounce the moment he let his guard down. Sometimes, as he walked through the town or worked on someone's home, he would catch himself thinking about the life he had left behind, the daughters he would never see again, the friends who would never know what had truly happened to him. He had escaped the law, but he hadn't escaped himself. There were moments when Richard wondered if he could ever truly atone for what he had done. He had fled to avoid the consequences, but the real punishment was the one he carried within himself, the knowledge that he had become a murderer. That he had allowed his anger and pain to drive him to such a dark place was a burden that no amount of distance could lighten. As the weeks turned into months, Richard settled into the routine of his new life, but the guilt never lessened. It was always there, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his revenge. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his sense of self, and in the end, he knew that this was his true punishment. He could hide from the world, but he could never hide from the man he had become.